Meredith Calloway had lived 4 years with a plastic bracelet on her wrist. Not jewelry. Not a gift from someone she loved. It was a hospital newborn band, the kind they clasp around a baby's wrist the moment it enters the world, yellowed with age. The printed words, Baby Calloway, so faded she had to tilt it toward the light to read them. She never took it off. 4 years ago, she had given birth prematurely in a small hospital on the outskirts of Chicago, alone. No husband, no family, no one sitting in the waiting room. That night, a nurse let her see her baby through the glass window of the NICU. 15 seconds. She only had 15 seconds before they pulled the curtain shut. But in those 15 seconds, she saw one thing clearly: a crescent-shaped birthmark on the baby's left wrist. After that, they told her the baby didn't make it. She never got to hold her child, never got a last look. They handed her the plastic bracelet and an apology. Then nothing. 4 years, she wore that bracelet every day. 4 years, she remembered that birthmark every night, until today. In the small tailor shop where she worked, a 4-year-old boy had just bumped into her leg. She knelt down, took his small hand to comfort him. Then her eyes stopped at his left wrist, a crescent-shaped birthmark. Same place, same shape, identical to the memory she had carried for 4 years. She couldn't breathe. The boy looked up and smiled the carefree grin of a child who had no idea that the woman holding his hand had just seen something she thought she had buried with her tears 4 years ago. And the man who walked into the shop right after, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder, calling him son, that man was Jonah Winslow, the most powerful man in Chicago. The boy was his adopted child. But he might just be her flesh and blood. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone who needs healing, because sometimes a single story is enough to change someone's day. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. That evening, Merritt went back to her rented room on the south side. She locked the door, set her handbag down on the floor, then sat straight down in the kitchen chair without turning on the main light. There was only the glow from her phone screen spilling across her face in the cramped room. She didn't eat. She didn't boil water. She didn't do any of the things she had done every night for the past 4 years, because tonight wasn't like any night before it. Tonight, there was only one image in her mind: the left wrist of the little boy in the tailor shop. She typed 3 words into the search bar. Jonah Winslow, Chicago. The screen returned dozens of results. Winslow Holdings, logistics, Great Lakes shipping ports, commercial real estate investment. An empire with a presence in every corner of the city, from the skyscrapers in the Loop to the warehouses along the southern riverfront. Jonah's photo appeared in a business article: a black suit, an expressionless face, eyes staring straight into the camera as though the camera itself was the thing that needed to explain why it existed. But Merritt didn't care about the empire. She scrolled down, searching for something else. There was no information about the boy, no family photos, no article mentioning children. Jonah Winslow kept his private life sealed as tightly as a safe. She set the phone down on the table and looked out the small window. Outside, there were car horns, music drifting from the bar at the end of the street, the sound of a city still living whether she was there or not. She wondered, what if I'm wrong? What if that birthmark is only a coincidence? What if she was building hope out of something that wasn't real, only to have to bury it all over again? But then she closed her eyes, and the image of the boy's wrist came back. Clear, exact, identical. Merritt opened her eyes. She couldn't ignore it. Even if she was wrong, she still had to know. The next morning, more than 40 minutes by car north of Merritt's rented room, Jonah Winslow was lying face down on the living room floor of his mansion, not because he wanted to, but because Beck, 4 years old, was sitting on his back, both hands gripping the collar of his shirt as if holding reins, shouting, "Faster! Make the horse run faster!" Jonah made a hoarse whinny. Not very well, but well enough to make Beck laugh so hard he nearly fell over. His sleeves were rolled up, his hair wasn't combed, and his socked feet slid across the wooden floor. If anyone in Chicago's underground business world had seen this scene, they wouldn't have believed this was the same man half the city respected and the other half didn't dare mention by name. Conrad Neal stepped into the living room and stopped at the doorway. He didn't knock because he knew Jonah had already heard his footsteps from the hallway. But he waited. Beck jumped off Jonah's back and ran to get a new toy. Only then did Conrad speak. "Harrison is trying to overturn the Eastport deal. He met privately with 3 shipping parties yesterday without going through us. Jonah stood up. The smile from moments ago vanished, as though it had never existed. His face returned to its default state. Calm, controlled, unreadable. Set a meeting for tonight. That night, in a private room at a restaurant in the Gold Coast, Jonah sat across from Harrison and 4 of his men. He didn't bring soldiers, just himself and 1 envelope. He placed the envelope on the table, opened it, and pushed it toward Harrison. Inside was the full file on the dirty transactions Harrison had hidden for the past 2 years. Harrison finished reading, and his face went pale. Jonah said exactly 1 sentence. 30 seconds. Choose. Harrison gave everything back before the clock ran out. At the car, Conrad opened the door. Jonah got into the back seat and loosened the button at the collar of his suit. The first thing he said wasn't about Harrison, wasn't about the port, wasn't about money. Is Beck asleep? Conrad looked through the rearview mirror. 10 minutes ago, hugging the stuffed dinosaur. Jonah nodded and looked out through the window. The city slid past outside the car. Millions of lights, millions of stories. And in a small rented room on the south side, a woman whose name he didn't yet know was lying awake, staring up at the ceiling, wondering whether her child was sleeping peacefully tonight. Merritt called in to ask for the next morning off work. The owner of the tailor shop asked if she was all right. She said she was fine, that she just needed 1 day. She didn't say what for. She caught the first bus at 6:30 in the morning, transferred to another one at the Southern Transit Station, then got off on a deserted street in the western suburbs of Chicago. Greenfield Hospital stood at the end of that street. Or, more accurately, what used to be Greenfield Hospital. The 3-story brown brick building was covered in dust. The glass doors at the front plastered with yellowed notices. The parking lot split open with weeds growing through every crack in the concrete. The place had gone bankrupt 2 years earlier, not because of a scandal, but because it had run out of money. At least, that was the reason on paper. Merritt walked around to the back. The rear iron door had a rusted lock that no longer latched. She pushed lightly, and the door opened with a metallic screech. Inside, it was dark and cold, and the smell of damp mold rushed into her nose. She turned on the flashlight on her phone and stepped through the narrow hallway, passing empty examination rooms, peeling walls, and ceilings mottled with water stains. She didn't stop to look around. She knew what she needed and where it was. The basement, the records storage room. The stairs down to the basement had no lights. Merritt took them 1 step at a time, one hand holding her phone, the other gripping the railing. The storage room was at the end of the lowest hallway, its wooden door already open. Inside, most of the metal shelves were empty. The records had been moved when the hospital closed, or destroyed. But the left corner of the room told a different story. The floor there had an old water stain, the trace of a burst pipe no one had bothered to repair. 3 rusted metal filing cabinets were jammed, leaning into one another, clearly abandoned, because no one had wanted the trouble of dragging them out. Merritt pulled the first drawer. Stuck. She used both hands and yanked hard. The drawer slid out with a grinding metal sound. Inside were damp, moldy files. The papers stuck to one another. She turned through them one by one under the glow of the flashlight, looking for her name. Calloway. Nothing. She checked the second drawer, the third, then the next cabinet. Her file didn't exist here. It had been erased, or it had never been stored in the right place at all. But in the last drawer of the third cabinet, Merritt found something else. 3 medical files from the same year she gave birth. 3 newborn cases recorded as didn't survive. She opened the first file. The mother was 23 years old, single, with no relatives accompanying her, admitted for a natural delivery. The baby recorded as deceased after 6 hours. The doctor's signature, Leland Marsh. The second file. The mother was 26 years old, single, no relatives, premature delivery. The baby recorded as deceased after 12 hours. Doctor's signature, Leland Marsh. The third file. 21 years old, single, no relatives. Same outcome. Same signature. Merritt sat down on the cold concrete floor. The 3 files spread out in front of her. 3 mothers. All of them single. All of them without anyone beside them. All of them told their babies had died. All of them signed off by the same doctor. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a medical mistake. This was a system. Someone had targeted women who had no one to protect them. Women who, when they lost a child, would have no one to ask questions on their behalf. Merritt photographed every page of the files, 3 cases, 17 photos in total. Her hand gripped the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She opened her email, attached all the photos, and sent them to Mrs. Gallagher's address, the owner of the tailor shop. She didn't explain much, only wrote, "If anything happens to me, please keep these photos." She hit send, checked it one more time, then stood up. She pushed the drawers back into place, turned off the flashlight, walked back down the hallway, up the stairs, and out the rear door. The sunlight outside made her squint after nearly an hour in the dark. Merritt stood in front of the abandoned building and took a long breath. She didn't know who Leland Marsh was, where he was, or whether he was even still alive. But she had his name. She had 3 files proving she wasn't the only one. And she had something she had thought she'd lost completely over the past 4 years. A direction. Merritt spent the next 3 days searching for Leland Marsh. She searched online medical directories, called the Illinois State Medical Association, tried every method a person who didn't have money to hire a private investigator could try. No results. Marsh had either left the state, or was living under another name, or simply didn't want to be found. While she waited, the name Bright Horizons Preschool kept coming back into her mind. She had found the school's name from a small post on the website of the St. Clair Charity Foundation, under Early Childhood Education Sponsorships, in the list of partner schools. Bright Horizons, Lincoln Park. She knew she shouldn't go there. She knew that clearly. But on the morning of the 4th day, her feet stepped onto the bus before reason had time to interfere. She stood across the street, about 50 meters from the school gate, pretending to look at her phone. At 9:15, a black car stopped in front of the gate. A man in a suit opened the back door. Beck stepped down, a small backpack on his shoulders, a lunchbox in his hand. The little boy waved goodbye to the driver, then ran through the gate, his curls bouncing with every step. Merritt watched until he disappeared behind the door. She stood there for 10 more seconds, then turned away. She didn't know those 10 seconds were more than enough. Conrad Neal was sitting in a car parked 30 meters away, the camera lens already recording her face from the first minute she appeared. He wasn't a careless man. Anyone who stood near Beck for too long without a reason was recorded, checked, and reported. That was the rule Jonah had put in place from the day he adopted Beck, and Conrad had never once made an exception. That afternoon, Conrad placed the photograph on Jonah's desk. This woman stood near Beck's school this morning. About 50 meters away, across the street, she stood there for about 10 minutes. I checked the security camera at the tailor shop on North Street and matched her identity. Her name is Meredith Calloway. She works as an alteration seamstress at Gallagher Tailor Shop on the south side. Purpose still unclear. Jonah looked at the photograph. 3 seconds. No words. Then he pushed the photo back toward Conrad. Bring her to meet me. No further questions. No need to know the reason yet. Anyone who approached Beck without going through him, he would find the answer himself. That afternoon, Merritt had just stepped out of the tailor shop after her shift when 2 men in black suits were standing beside a car parked close to the curb. One man opened the car door. The other looked straight at her. "Miss Calloway, Mr. Winslow wants to see you." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. Merritt looked at the 2 men, looked at the car, then looked back at the familiar street behind her. She drew in a breath, then stepped into the car. The car stopped in front of the Winslow Holdings building in the financial district. Merritt stepped out and looked up. Black glass, steel, 30 floors stabbing straight into the Chicago sky. The 2 men in suits led her through the main lobby without saying a word. The lobby was wide, the stone floor polished, the reception desk made of marble, security staff stationed at every corner. Everything in this building said the same thing. You're walking into the territory of someone much larger than you. The elevator took her to the top floor, a long hallway, black glass doors, thick carpet swallowing every footstep. The men in suits who passed her all looked at her with the same eyes, the kind of eyes that were deciding whether she was a nuisance or a threat. Merritt kept her back straight, eyes forward. She knew that if she lowered her head here, she wouldn't be able to lift it again. The door at the end of the hallway opened. The office was vast, with glass walls overlooking the entire city. Jonah Winslow sat behind his desk and didn't stand. He didn't need to stand. Everything in this room had already stood up for him. He watched Merritt walk in, his dark eyes flat and still, offering no invitation to sit. Conrad stood beside the door, arms folded across his chest. You followed my son, Jonah said. It wasn't a question. I'm giving you 1 minute to explain before I decide how to handle this. His voice was low, even, without a single ripple in it. The voice of a man so used to giving orders that he didn't need to raise it to make other people afraid. Merritt stood in front of the desk, with no chair and no invitation. She looked at Jonah. Then she did something perhaps no one had ever done in that room. She lifted her hand to her left wrist and removed the newborn plastic bracelet. For the first time in 4 years, her wrist was bare. She placed the bracelet on the oak desktop. The plastic was yellowed, the letters faded, slightly warped from 4 years of being worn and never removed. It lay there, in the middle of the broad, polished desk, beside a pen plated in gold, and a mechanical desk clock that was probably worth more than a full year of rent for her room. 2 things that didn't belong to the same world, but they were here, on the same tabletop. Your son has a birthmark on his left wrist. A crescent moon shape, Merritt said, her voice clear. 4 years ago, I gave birth at Greenfield Hospital, outside the city. They let me look at my baby for 15 seconds through a glass window. In those 15 seconds, I saw that birthmark on the baby's left wrist. Same place, same shape. After that, they told me my child didn't make it. I wasn't allowed to hold my baby. I wasn't allowed to see the face. They handed me this bracelet and told me to go home. She stopped and drew in a breath. For 4 years, I believed that, until I held your son's hand in the tailor shop and saw his left wrist. Jonah didn't move. His face still gave away nothing. But he didn't interrupt her, and he didn't call security. A birthmark isn't proof, he said after a while. Many people have similar birthmarks. You want me to believe a story based only on a mark on someone's skin? No, Merritt answered. I want you to do a DNA test. Silence. If I'm wrong, she continued, I'll disappear. You'll never see my face again, I promise you that. But if I'm right, then 4 years ago, someone looked me in the face and told me my child had died while that child was still alive. And you need to know that truth every bit as much as I do. Jonah looked at her. Then his eyes shifted down to the plastic bracelet on the desk. He didn't push it away. He reached out and picked it up, turned it in his hand, tilted it toward the light from the glass wall, and read the faded line, Baby Calloway. He looked at the bracelet longer than he looked at her. Then he set it down, very slowly, very neatly, as if it were something valuable, and not a cheap piece of plastic. Go home, he said. I'll contact you. No promise, no refusal, just 3 words. Merritt nodded once. She didn't ask when. She didn't beg for more. She didn't repeat anything she had already said. She turned and walked out of the office. Conrad opened the door for her, his face expressionless. Merritt walked down the long hallway, into the elevator, down to the lobby, and out through the front entrance. Her steps were steady, her back straight, her eyes looking ahead. But when she turned the first street corner, out of sight of the black glass building, her knees buckled. She leaned back against the wall, both hands braced on her thighs, breathing hard as if she had just finished running a long distance. She looked down at her left wrist. Bare. The bracelet was still on Jonah Winslow's desk, and now, all she could do was wait. 5 days later, an unnamed white envelope was placed on Jonah's desk at 8 o'clock in the morning. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first was the DNA test result, performed by a private laboratory through Conrad's own channel. Comparison samples. Sample A taken from Beck's toothbrush. Sample B from a strand of Merritt's hair left behind on the chair at the Winslow Holdings office 5 days earlier. Result: 99.97% match. Biological relationship: birth mother. The second sheet was a technical confirmation. Indicators, charts, the kinds of things Jonah didn't need to read. One number was enough: 99.97. Jonah stood beside the desk, holding the result in one hand. He finished reading it in 30 seconds. Then, he placed the paper down on the desktop, very slowly, 1 millimeter at a time, as though the speed with which he set the paper down was inversely proportional to the speed at which everything inside him was collapsing. He stood there for a while longer. Didn't call anyone, didn't pick up the phone, didn't open a window, or pour a drink, or do any of the things people usually do when they receive news that changes their life. He only stood there. Then he walked out of the office, went up to the 2nd floor of the mansion, and followed the hallway to Beck's bedroom. The door was slightly open. Inside, Beck was taking his afternoon nap. The blanket was pulled up to his chest, his pillow a little crooked, his curls falling messily over half his forehead. The stuffed dinosaur was wedged between his small arm and the side of the bed. Jonah stepped inside, so lightly the wooden floor didn't make a sound. He pulled the small chair closer and sat down beside the bed. He didn't touch him, didn't wake him, only looked. Beck breathed evenly, his chest rising and falling softly, his mouth slightly open. 4 years old. 4 years Jonah had raised this child. And now, a sheet of paper lying on the desk downstairs had just told him that the child sleeping in front of him had a mother. A real mother. A mother of flesh and blood, living in a rented room on the south side, working as an alteration seamstress, and wearing a yellowed plastic bracelet for 4 years because she had believed her child was no longer in this world. Jonah sat there for 3 more minutes. Then he stood, pulled the blanket up to Beck's shoulders, and stepped out. He picked up his phone and called Conrad before closing Beck's bedroom door. Investigate Greenfield Hospital. Everything connected to Meredith Calloway's delivery 4 years ago. Which doctor was on duty? Which nurse worked the shift? Who signed the papers? Who received the records? He paused for a beat. And find out where the St. Clair Foundation received Beck from. Through whom? With what paperwork? Conrad didn't ask why. He heard Jonah's voice and understood this wasn't the time to ask. Jonah's network didn't need much time. When a man had enough money, enough people, and enough reason to dig, everything buried underground had to come to light. 1 week. That was all. Each piece was placed on Jonah's desk. Not all at once, but day by day, file by file, report call by report call from Conrad. The first day, Beck's adoption records from the St. Clair Foundation. On paper, Beck was recorded as a newborn abandoned at the hospital, with no parental information. The paperwork was clean, the seals complete, the signatures valid. The approving officer, Patricia Sloan, executive director of the St. Clair Foundation. The third day, the money trail. Conrad found transfers from the St. Clair Foundation to Greenfield Hospital within the 2 years before the hospital went bankrupt. They weren't ordinary medical grants. The amounts were larger than reasonable, transferred into the personal accounts of Dr. Leland Marsh and 2 night shift head nurses. On the books, the payments were recorded as support for the newborn care program. In reality, it was money buying silence. The 5th day, the list. Conrad cross-checked the St. Clair Foundation records against Greenfield Hospital data and found 7 cases of newborns the foundation had received from Greenfield within 3 years. All of them were recorded as abandoned children. All of them matched cases the hospital had recorded as didn't survive. All of them were children of single mothers, with no relatives, no one to come back and ask even one more question after being told their babies were dead. The 6th day, the name Wesley Greer appeared. Jonah's financial lieutenant, the man who had managed the entire cash flow of Winslow Holdings for 10 years. Conrad discovered that Wesley had known about the unusual transfers from the St. Clair Foundation for at least 3 years. Instead of reporting them, Wesley contacted Patricia, and from then on, the 2 sides split the profits that moved through Winslow's financial system. Wesley didn't betray Jonah out of ambition. Wesley hid it from Jonah out of self-preservation. The 7th day, Jonah sat alone in his office. The desk was covered with files, highlighters, and photographs of documents. He didn't need Conrad to summarize. He could see the whole picture himself. His mother, Dorothy Winslow, had founded the St. Clair Foundation 20 years earlier to help orphans and abandoned children. She had believed the Winslow family's power had to be used to protect children who had no one to protect them. When she died, Jonah entrusted the foundation to Patricia, the woman his mother had trusted most. And Patricia had turned his mother's legacy into a system of forged medical records, taking children out of the arms of mothers who had no strength to fight back, then passing those children through the foundation as though it were charity. Right under Dorothy Winslow's name, right under Jonah's eyes. Conrad stood beside him, silent. He had never seen Jonah sit still for so long. Not the stillness of a man thinking, but the stillness of a man who had already finished thinking, and what he had thought of was something no one would want to be standing near when it finally erupted. While Jonah dug from the top down with money and power, Merritt dug from the bottom up with stubbornness. She had no network, no people. But she had the name Leland Marsh and the persistence of someone who had nothing left to lose. After 3 days of searching with no results, she changed her approach. Instead of looking through online directories, She called the Illinois State Medical Association directly, saying she was a granddaughter trying to find a grandfather she had lost contact with, a man who had once been a doctor. The operator wasn't allowed to provide an address, but confirmed that Dr. Leland Marsh had retired and that his medical license was still registered at an address in Joliet, in the southern suburbs of Chicago. Merritt took the bus the next morning. Joliet was about an hour and a half from downtown Chicago. She got off in a quiet residential neighborhood, where one-story houses stood along a tree-shaded road. Marsh's house was at the end of the street, its white paint gone gray, a low fence out front, the front yard uncut. She knocked on the door. She had to knock 3 times before there was the sound of slippers dragging across the floor. The door opened. Leland Marsh stood in front of her, a thin old man with sparse gray hair, sunken eyes, and a wrinkled shirt hastily tucked into his pants. He looked at her with the eyes of someone used to living alone and not wanting that to change. "I don't subscribe to newspapers, and I'm not religious. What are you selling?" "I'm not selling anything," Merritt said. "I want to ask you about Greenfield Hospital." Marsh's eyes changed. Not much, but enough. The tired look was replaced by something sharper, more guarded. "That hospital is closed." "I know. I gave birth there 4 years ago. They told me my baby didn't survive. But I found 3 other files, from the same year, signed by the same doctor. All of them recorded newborn deaths. All of them were single mothers. And the doctor's name on all 3 files was Leland Marsh." Marsh stood motionless in the doorway. His hand tightened around the doorknob. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and dry. "You know what happened." Merritt didn't ask. She stated it. Marsh opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked out at the street, then to both sides as if checking whether anyone was watching. Then he stepped back inside and left the door open. Merritt walked in. The living room was small, the furniture old, the curtains drawn tight. Marsh sat down in an armchair, both hands resting on his thighs. He watched as Merritt placed her phone on the table and opened the folder of photos she had taken of the files in the hospital basement. "I have proof," she said. Marsh looked at the photos. His hands began to tremble. He opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of car engines stopping outside cut everything off. Not 1 car. 2 cars. Marsh looked through the gap in the curtains, and his face went white. "Go out the back door. Now," he said, but it was already too late. The front door was pushed open. 2 men stepped inside, fast, decisive, without a word. Merritt was grabbed by the arm and pulled out of the chair before she could react. She tried to wrench herself free, but the second man blocked her from behind and pinned both her arms. Marsh was shoved back into the chair, one man standing in front of him to block him. No one shouted. No one explained. Everything happened in organized silence. Merritt and Marsh were taken out to the car, blindfolded, and driven away. Patricia's people had been watching Marsh ever since Jonah began investigating, and Merritt had arrived at the exact moment they were preparing to clean up every loose end. 20 minutes later, Merritt was sitting on the cold concrete floor of an abandoned warehouse, her back against an iron column, her hands tied behind her with plastic zip ties. Marsh sat a few meters away from her, silent, his head lowered. 2 guards stood outside the door, speaking quietly. Merritt didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't call anyone, because there was no one to call. She sat still, breathed evenly, and clenched her left wrist with the fingers trapped behind her back. She thought, "If I don't get out of here, no one will know where I am." Mrs. Gallagher had the photos of the files in her email, but she wouldn't understand what they were. Jonah had the DNA results, but he had no reason to look for her. She would disappear, just as her child had disappeared 4 years ago. And no one would ask even one more question. But Merritt was wrong about one thing. She didn't know that from the moment she left the tailor shop that morning, a black car had been following her. Conrad Neal, under Jonah's orders after the meeting at the office, never let Merritt out of his sight. He followed her to Joliet and parked 3 houses away from Marsh's home. He saw Merritt go inside. Then he saw 2 unfamiliar cars arrive. He saw someone drag Merritt out and push her into a car. Conrad didn't have enough men to intervene alone. He knew that. So he did the only thing he could do. He called Jonah. "Merritt has been taken. 2 cars, 4 men, heading southwest. I'm following them." Merritt had been sitting in the warehouse for nearly 3 hours when she heard cars stopping outside. Not the sound of a truck or a van like when she had been brought there. This sound was different. Several cars, stopping at the same time, their engines shutting off almost together. Then footsteps, many footsteps, steady, fast, organized. The 2 guards outside the door stopped talking. One of them pulled the warehouse door open a crack and looked out. Then he closed it, turned to the other man, and Merritt heard his voice change completely, from calm to panicked in just 2 words. Winslow. It's Winslow. The footsteps outside stopped. The warehouse door opened, not shoved, not kicked in. It was drawn aside slowly, calmly, as though the person opening it had all the time in the world. Afternoon light spilled in. Jonah Winslow stepped across the threshold. He didn't run, didn't shout, didn't carry anything in his hands. He only walked in and stood there, looking at the 2 guards. Not a word. Conrad stood behind him, along with 3 more men, but they didn't need to do anything, because the 2 guards had already realized who was standing in front of them. One of the 2 had once worked for a transport group under Winslow Holdings' control 3 years earlier. He knew that face. He knew what that silence meant. He didn't need to hear anything else. He ran for the back door, and the other man ran after him before Jonah even opened his mouth. Not because Jonah gave an order, but because they understood that staying would be the last decision they'd ever make for themselves. Jonah stepped deeper into the warehouse. His eyes swept across the dark space, searching. Marsh sat in the left corner, trembling but unhurt, and in the right corner, leaning back against an iron column, her hands restrained behind her, was Merritt. She lifted her head when she heard the footsteps. Her eyes met his in the darkness. She said nothing. Neither did he. Conrad stepped forward and cut the restraints off Merritt and Marsh. Merritt stood up. On her own, she didn't need anyone to hold her, didn't need anyone to help her walk. She straightened her clothes, brushed her hair away from her face, and walked out of the warehouse on her own 2 feet. But her steps were slower than usual, and when she sat in the back seat of Jonah's car, when the door closed and the outside world was blocked by the dark-tinted glass, only then did Merritt clasp both hands together and set them on her lap. Her fingers tightened around one another until they went white. Jonah sat in the seat beside her. Conrad drove. The car began to move. Silence stretched through the first 10 minutes. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of 2 people who had just passed through something both of them needed time to put back into place. Merritt spoke first. "Thank you." Her voice was hoarse, lower than usual. Jonah didn't turn to look at her. His eyes stayed straight ahead. "Don't thank me, and don't ever do something like that alone again." Silence again. The car passed through a large intersection. Streetlights swept across both their faces, then disappeared. Then Jonah added, softer, almost only loud enough for her to hear, "If something happens to you, Beck will lose his mother a second time. This time for real." Merritt turned to look at him. That was the first time Jonah had called her Beck's mother. Not through a test result, not through legal language, but in the way he said the word mother, as though it were an obvious truth, one that no longer needed anyone to prove it. The DNA result confirmed it, he continued, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone. "Beck is your biological son, 99.97%. Merritt didn't answer. She turned her face toward the car window. Outside, Chicago slowly fell behind them. The buildings, the streetlights, the people. Her eyes filled. Tears ran down her cheeks, slow, silent, with no crying sound, no sobs, just water, falling, as though her body had begun releasing something she had held inside for too long without asking her permission. Jonah saw it. He said nothing, didn't offer a handkerchief, didn't touch her. He let her cry in her own way. The car stopped in front of Merritt's rented room on the south side. Conrad turned off the engine. Merritt wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, drew in a long breath, then said, "I have evidence. Photos of medical records from the basement of Greenfield Hospital. 3 other cases besides mine. Same doctor's signature, same pattern. I'll send them to you." Jonah looked at her. "When did you find those things?" "Before I knew who you were." "Alone?" Merritt opened the car door, one foot already stepping down onto the sidewalk. She turned back to look at him. "I've always been alone. That isn't new." She stepped out, closed the car door, and walked into the rented building without looking back. Jonah sat in the car, watching the door close behind her. Conrad looked through the rearview mirror, waiting for an order. Jonah said nothing for a while. Then he spoke, his voice low. "That woman broke into an abandoned hospital alone. found evidence an entire system had hidden for 4 years, then went looking for a witness by herself and nearly died for it. He stopped. And she did all of that without anyone beside her. Conrad nodded but said nothing. He knew Jonah didn't need anyone to answer. He was speaking to himself. The car rolled away from the south side. In the rented room on the 3rd floor, Merritt sat at the kitchen table, opened her phone, and began sending each photo of the records to the phone number Conrad had given her before she got out of the car. 17 photos. Evidence she had found with her bare hands in a dark basement. A weapon that Jonah Winslow, with all his money and power, could never have found on his own without her. 3 days after Merritt sent the photos of the records, Jonah called Patricia Sloan to the Winslow Holdings office. He didn't give a reason. He only said, 10 o'clock in the morning. Don't be late. Patricia arrived on time, as she always did. 60 years old, silver hair twisted neatly into a bun, gray coat, a strand of pearls around her neck. She walked into Jonah's office with the polite smile of someone accustomed to sitting at the same table with power. She had run the St. Clair Foundation for 4 years after Dorothy died. She attended meetings with the city council, went to fundraising galas, and shook hands with the mayor every Christmas season. No one suspected her. No one ever had. Jonah sat behind his desk. No tea offered. No invitation to sit. On the desktop, a stack of files had already been arranged. Sit, he said. Patricia sat, her eyes flicking toward the stack of files. The polite smile stayed in place, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. Jonah didn't explain. He opened the first file and pushed it toward her. Beck's adoption record from the St. Clair Foundation, listing him as an abandoned child, with Patricia Sloan's approving signature. The second file, money transfers from the foundation to Dr. Leland Marsh's personal account, disguised as medical sponsorships. The third file, photographs of the records from 3 newborn cases marked as dead at Greenfield, signed by the same doctor, all involving single mothers with the same pattern. The fourth file, the DNA result. Beck and Meredith Calloway, a 99.97% match. Patricia looked through each file. Her smile disappeared by the second one. By the fourth, her hands, resting in her lap, had curled into fists. Jonah, I can explain. I didn't invite you here to hear an explanation. Those children, Patricia said, her voice still calm though her eyes had changed, were placed with better families. Those mothers weren't capable of raising children. No money, no home, no future. I gave those children a chance. Are you finished? The voice wasn't Jonah's. Patricia turned to her right. The door to the adjoining conference room had opened. Merritt stepped out. She wore clean but simple clothes, her hair tied back neatly, her face calm. She stood 3 steps away from Patricia and looked straight into her eyes. Patricia recognized her. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, then narrowed again. She hadn't expected Merritt to be there. You said those mothers weren't capable of raising children, Merritt said, her voice clear, neither rising nor falling. Did you ask them? Did you stand in front of each of them and ask whether they wanted to keep their babies? Or did you just look at their circumstances and decide for them? Patricia didn't answer. 4 years ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, alone, having just given birth, and a doctor you paid looked me in the face and told me my baby didn't survive, while he was still breathing. You had everything. Money, reputation, power, and you used all of it to do that, to take children from women who had no strength to fight back. Then you called it charity. Merritt stopped. So who's the one who doesn't deserve anything? Patricia was silent, not because she had no arguments left, but because, for the first time, someone had spoken the truth straight to her face, a truth no one around her had ever dared to say. Jonah let the silence stretch for a few more seconds. Then he said, his voice flat, "The St. Clair Foundation will be dissolved. All records have been transferred to the lawyers. You'll leave here and never come back." Patricia stood. For the first time, she looked at Jonah with eyes that could no longer hold on to politeness. But she said nothing more. She walked out of the room, her heels striking the stone floor, and the door closed behind her. Less than an hour later, Wesley Greer walked into the large conference room at Winslow Holdings for the weekly internal meeting. 12 people sat around the long table. Wesley took his usual seat, the second chair on Jonah's right, the position he had held for 10 years. He opened his laptop, arranged his documents, and nodded in greeting to everyone around the table. He didn't know this was his final meeting. Jonah began in a normal voice. Quarterly reports, port figures, shipping schedules. Then he stopped, opened another file, and began placing papers on the table, one sheet at a time, without hurry. The first sheet, a record of a transfer from the St. Clair Foundation through an intermediary account Wesley controlled. The second sheet, a transfer order from that intermediary account to Wesley's personal account at an out-of-state bank. The third sheet, emails between Wesley and Patricia Sloan confirming the divided payments. Each sheet landed on the table like another brick building a wall around Wesley. The conference room went utterly still. The other 11 people looked from the papers to Wesley, then to Jonah, then back to Wesley again. No one breathed loudly. Wesley didn't run, didn't defend himself. He looked down at the last sheet of paper, and his shoulders collapsed, slowly, like a building losing its foundation. No one struck him, but he was stripped bare in front of 11 people who had once called him second in command. That was a punishment heavier than anything violence could have done. Jonah didn't say another word to Wesley. He only looked at Conrad. Conrad nodded. Wesley stood and was led out of the room. The door closed. The conference room remained silent. Then one of the group, a regional manager from the East Port District, spoke. The woman connected to the St. Clair Foundation matter. Who is she? Jonah stood at the head of the table and swept his gaze over every face. 11 people. 11 pairs of eyes waiting for an answer. 4 years ago, someone took her child and told her the baby had died. That child is Beck, my son. She's his birth mother. He paused, looked once more around the table. Anyone in this room who needs me to explain why I'm protecting the mother of my son should stand up and leave before I change my mind about my patients. No one stood. No one said another word. 1 week after Patricia left Winslow Holdings, Jonah called Merritt. Not through Conrad. He called her himself. This Saturday, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Come to my house. Beck will be home. He didn't explain further, and Merritt didn't ask anything else. She knew what this was. Saturday, 4 o'clock. Merritt stood in front of the gate of the Winslow mansion, drawing in a breath so deep it made her lungs ache. She had faced the most powerful crime boss in Chicago without blinking. She had been held in a warehouse without screaming or crying. But standing before this gate, knowing that inside was a 4-year-old boy she had carried and given birth to, only to be told he had died, she felt her knees go weak. Conrad opened the gate. He led her in. The living room was wide, with a high ceiling, afternoon light pouring through the large glass windows. Merritt stepped inside, and her eyes moved everywhere, beyond her control. Toys stacked in a basket beside the sofa, a scribbled crayon drawing taped to the refrigerator door in the kitchen, a tiny pair of shoes left crookedly by the doorway, a dinosaur-shaped pillow on the armchair. 4 years. 4 years of her son's life were scattered all over this house, in every drawing, every toy, every crayon mark on the wall that someone had tried to wipe away but couldn't fully erase, and she hadn't been there for any of it. "You're the lady from the clothes shop." Beck's voice rang out from the stairs. The little boy ran down, his curls bouncing with every step, his eyes lighting up when he recognized Merritt. He remembered her. From that single meeting in the tailor shop, he remembered. "That's right," Merritt said, and she was surprised her voice still sounded normal. "I'm the lady from the clothes shop." Beck ran to her, stopped in front of her, and looked up. "Did you come to play with Beck?" "Yes, I came to play with Beck." Jonah stood in the hallway, his hands in his pockets, watching them. He didn't say anything, didn't step in. He only stood there, watching the woman he had once threatened in his office, now crouching down to his son's eye level and speaking to him in the gentlest voice he had ever heard. Beck pulled Merritt over to the small table in the corner of the living room, where colored paper, crayons, and plastic scissors were scattered everywhere. "Do you know how to fold airplanes?" he asked. "I do." Merritt took a sheet of white paper and folded each crease slowly so Beck could follow. Her hands were used to needles and thread, so every fold was sharp and clean. She handed the paper airplane to Beck. His eyes widened as he took it, threw it, and watched it glide in a circle before landing softly on the floor. Beck laughed, then wanted to fold one himself. Merritt gave him paper. Beck folded the first one crooked. The second one came out twisted. On the third try, he got angry, crumpled the paper, and threw it onto the table. "It won't work." Merritt didn't say, "Keep trying." She didn't say, "You can do it." She picked up the crumpled paper, smoothed each wrinkle flat with her palm, then folded it again. Slowly, carefully, crease by crease, she handed the newly folded airplane to Beck. Wrinkled paper can still fly. You just have to fold it back the right way. Beck looked at the airplane in his hand, then looked up at her. He threw it to try. The airplane glided, tilted a little because the paper was wrinkled, but it still flew. Beck laughed, and Merritt laughed with him. They folded 5 more airplanes. Beck messed up 2 more times, but he didn't crumple the paper anymore. He smoothed it flat and folded it again, the way she had done. When Merritt left, Conrad drove her home. She sat in the back seat, silent, looking down at the 2 hands resting in her lap. The 2 hands that had just held her son's hand, that had just taught him to fold a paper airplane, that had just touched 4 years she had thought were lost forever. She clasped her hands together tightly, as if the warmth on her skin would fade if she let go. 3 days after the paper airplane folding, Merritt received a call at 12:43 at night. She was lying in bed, not yet asleep, because lately, sleep had become harder for her than before, not because of grief the way it had been for the past 4 years, but because, for the first time, she had something to wait for, and waiting kept her more awake than any pain ever had. The name on the screen, Jonah Winslow. Merritt sat up and answered. Jonah's voice on the other end was different from every other time she had heard it. Not cold, not controlled, not flat. It was short, urgent, and there was something cracked underneath it that he was trying to hold back. Beck is in the hospital. Acute pneumonia. Fever of 40.3 degrees. And it won't come down. He paused for a beat. You should come. He didn't say why she should come. Didn't explain. But Merritt understood. If anything happened to Beck, his birth mother had to be there. Not because of the law, but because it was right. Which hospital? Northwestern Memorial. Pediatric Emergency Department. I'll have someone pick you up. No need. I'll get there myself. Merritt got dressed in 2 minutes. Called a taxi in 3 minutes. Sat in the car for 15 minutes, watching Chicago drift past the window at 1 o'clock in the morning. The streets empty. Traffic lights blinking yellow. A few lonely figures walking under the street lamps. She clasped both hands tightly in her lap. She didn't pray because she didn't know who to pray to. She only thought, he has to be okay. He has to be okay. When Merritt walked into the Pediatric Emergency Department at Northwestern Memorial, she saw Jonah immediately. Not because he was standing or pacing, but because he was sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway, his head lowered, both elbows braced on his thighs, his hands clasped together in front of him. Conrad stood a few steps away, his back against the wall, his face tense. 2 guards stood at both ends of the hallway, but none of them could do anything, because the enemy this time wasn't a person. Not Patricia, not Wesley, not anyone Jonah could place an envelope of evidence in front of and say, 30 seconds, choose. The enemy this time was a fever of 40.3 degrees inside the small body of a 4-year-old child. And Jonah Winslow, the crime boss who controlled everything in this city, was sitting on a plastic chair and controlling nothing at all. Merritt walked over and sat down in the chair beside him. No greeting, no asking for an update, no saying any of the things people usually say in hospitals in the middle of the night. Things like, everything will be all right, or the doctors here are very good. She only sat, beside him, in silence. The 2 of them sat there for 15 minutes without speaking. The hospital hallway was quiet, with only the sound of machines from the room inside, the quick steps of nurses across the floor, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Then Merritt said softly, without looking at him, "He'll be okay. He's your son. He's stubborn." Jonah lifted his head and turned to look at her. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from staying awake, from holding himself together, from swallowing everything down. "He's your son," he said. "He's headstrong." And that was the moment the 2 of them, for the first time, spoke about Beck by accepting him as the child of them both. Not on a test result, not in an office with legal files, but on 2 cold plastic chairs outside an emergency room, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, when both of them were so afraid they couldn't put it into words. 2:45 in the morning. The doctor came out. The fever had gone down. Beck was responding to antibiotics. His condition was stable. He needed further monitoring, but he was past the danger. Jonah stood when he heard the news, and Merritt saw his shoulders lower. Not much, but enough for her to realize he had been holding them rigid for hours. They were allowed into the room at 3 o'clock in the morning. Beck lay on the small hospital bed, an IV line on the back of his hand, his face pale but peaceful. He was asleep. Jonah pulled a chair to the left side of the bed. Merritt sat on the right. The room was small, the yellow light gentle, the heart monitor beeping in a steady rhythm. Beck breathed evenly, his chest rising and falling softly. About 10 minutes later, Beck stirred. His eyes opened a little, hazy, not fully awake. He looked to the left and saw Jonah. Looked to the right and saw Merritt. He said nothing, didn't call out to anyone, didn't ask where he was or why there was a line in his hand. He only reached out with his left hand and took Jonah's finger. Then he reached out with his right hand and took Merritt's finger and pulled, just lightly. Those tiny hands pulled 2 larger hands closer, closer, until all 3 of them were within the distance where a 4-year-old child could feel safe. Then Beck closed his eyes, held tight, and went back to sleep. Merritt looked at her son's hand holding her finger. For 4 years, she had believed this hand didn't exist in the world. For 4 years, she had looked at the plastic bracelet and imagined how small her child's hand would be, how warm it would feel, how tightly it would hold on to her. Now it was here, real, warm, and truly holding tight. She didn't cry. She only sat, breathed, and held on. Across the bed, Jonah sat too, breathed too, held on too, and neither of them let go first. 2 adults drawn together by a 4-year-old child with 2 tiny hands. Outside the window, Chicago slept. But inside this hospital room, 3 people stayed awake together in the way only people who were about to become a family could stay awake. Beck was discharged after 4 days. The little boy recovered quickly in the way only children can recover, as if their bodies don't know how to hold on to the memory of sickness. On the first day home, Beck already wanted to run out into the garden. On the second day, Beck was laughing loudly again. On the third day, Beck asked whether Merritt was coming over to play. Merritt came, more often than before, 2, 3 times a week. She and Jonah never said out loud what kind of arrangement this was. No contract, no official visitation schedule. It was simply that Jonah didn't forbid it, and Merritt didn't miss a single chance to be near her son. She came, played with Beck, folded paper airplanes, read stories, and sat watching him draw. Beck got used to her quickly. Children don't need a reason to like someone, they only need to feel safe. And beside Merritt, Beck felt safe in a way he couldn't explain, but also didn't need to explain. Miss Merritt was good at folding airplanes. Miss Merritt sat on the floor to play and wasn't afraid of getting dirty. Miss Merritt never told Beck to go play somewhere else when grown-ups were talking. That was enough. On a Thursday afternoon, Merritt was sitting on the living room floor with Beck, the 2 of them building a train out of old paper boxes. Beck was seriously ordering her which car had to go first, which one came after, and which one carried the dinosaurs. Merritt followed every instruction with the seriousness of someone receiving orders from the most powerful 4-year-old commander in Chicago. Then the front door opened. Familiar footsteps sounded on the wooden floor. Beck lifted his head, and his whole world lit up. "Daddy!" Beck sprang to his feet, abandoning the paper box train as it collapsed in a messy heap, and ran across the living room, his tiny feet pattering on the floor. "Daddy! Daddy! Pick Beck up!" Jonah had just stepped through the door, his suit jacket still on, his tie loosened, his face still carrying the traces of a long day. But when Beck rushed into his legs, both arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his face changed completely. He bent down, lifted Beck up, and settled him on his hip. Beck hugged his neck and buried his face against his shoulder. Jonah kissed the boy's forehead and murmured something Merritt couldn't hear. And Beck laughed, a clear, weightless laugh, the laugh of a child who trusted absolutely the person holding him. Daddy wasn't a word Beck had learned to say. It was a word Beck lived every day. 4 years. For 4 years, Jonah had held him every night when he came home. For 4 years, that call had echoed through this mansion, as natural as breathing, with no one needing to teach it, no one needing to explain it. Beck's daddy was Jonah. That was the simplest and most painful truth Merritt saw that afternoon. She stood a few steps away from father and son, still holding one paper box train car in her hand, her legs still in the posture of someone who had just risen from sitting on the floor. She watched Beck tucked against Jonah's shoulder, his face pressed into the collar of Jonah's suit, his mouth still babbling about the dinosaur train, and she felt something in her chest crack. Not loudly, not sharply, just a slow crack, like concrete under pressure for too long, not shattering all at once, but splitting gradually, silently, deeply. She turned her face away, set the paper train car down on the floor, straightened her back. "I have to leave early today," she said, her voice normal. Or at least she tried to make it normal. "Thank you for letting me come." Jonah looked at her over Beck's shoulder. He saw it. He saw all of it. He saw the way her shoulders trembled slightly when she turned away. He saw the way she clenched her hand when she said goodbye. He saw the way her eyes avoided Beck when the little boy called him Daddy. He knew what was happening. But he didn't call her back, because he didn't know what he should say, because he couldn't tell Beck not to call him Daddy, and he couldn't tell Merritt not to hurt. Merritt walked out the door, down the front path, through the iron gate, and disappeared from view. She walked to the end of the street before calling a taxi because she didn't want to stand in front of Jonah's house waiting for a car. In the taxi, she looked out the window. The city slid past. She didn't see any of it. When she got back to her rented room, she locked the door, didn't turn on the light, and sat down on the edge of the bed. And for the first time in 4 years, Merritt cried. Not the kind of tears that had run silently down her cheeks in Jonah's car that night. This time was different. This time, she cried with her whole body, shoulders shaking, hands clutching the blanket, breath breaking apart. She cried like someone whose dam had finally burst after holding back water for 4 years. But she wasn't crying because she had lost her child. She had already cried enough for that over the past 4 years. This time, she cried because of the opposite. She cried because she had found her child, then realized that finding him didn't mean having him back. Her son was alive. Her son was healthy, bright with laughter, loved dinosaurs, and knew how to fold airplanes. Her son had a father who loved him with everything he had, and her son called that man by a word she had never once heard from his mouth. Daddy, not Mommy. She was Miss Merritt, the person who came over to play, the person who was good at folding airplanes, the person who sat on the floor, not Mommy. Merritt sat in the darkness of her rented room, looked down at her bare left wrist, and wondered, did she have the right to claim back what life had taken from her? Or did she only have the right to stand at the edge, watch her son live happily in someone else's arms, and be grateful that at least he was alive? Merritt didn't go to Jonah's house for the entire week after that afternoon. She went to work every morning, altered clothes every day, returned to her rented room every night, cooked noodles, sat at the kitchen table, looked out the window. The loop was exactly the same as it had been 4 years before. Every movement, every habit, every footstep on the same old road. But she knew it was different. 4 years ago, she had lived inside that loop because there was nothing outside it. Now, she lived inside that loop because what existed outside it was too enormous for her to know what to do with. Her phone had 2 missed calls from Jonah's number. She didn't answer, not because she was angry, but because she still didn't know what she would say if she picked up. Beck asked too, Jonah told her later. "Where's Miss Merritt?" "Why isn't Miss Merritt coming?" Jonah answered. "Miss Merritt is busy." Beck didn't ask more. But every afternoon, he looked toward the door once. Every night at the kitchen table, Merritt faced the same question. It came back every night, unchanged, no easier, no lighter. Take Beck back. She had the right. DNA was on her side. The law was on her side. She was his birth mother, robbed of her child by a system of forged medical records. Any court in the United States would lean toward her if she presented the evidence. She could fight for custody. She could bring Beck back to the small rented room on the south side, let him sleep in her bed, cook for him every morning, walk him to school, and for the first time, hear her child call her by the word she had waited 4 years to hear. But taking Beck back would also mean pulling him out of the home where he had grown up, out of the bedroom he knew, out of the garden where he played, out of the arms of the man he called Daddy, with bright, clear laughter every afternoon. He would cry. He wouldn't understand. He would ask why he couldn't go home, why Daddy wasn't coming, why everything had changed. And Merritt would have to look into the eyes of her son, a 4-year-old child, and explain something even adults couldn't explain. Let go. Step back. Leave Beck where he was happy. Let him keep calling Jonah Daddy. Keep laughing every afternoon. Keep sleeping peacefully every night. And Merritt would return to her rented room, return to the tailor shop, return to her old life. But this time, it would be 1,000 times heavier, because the first time she lost her child, she didn't have a choice. People took her son away, and she couldn't do anything. But this time, if she let go, it would be her choice. She would be setting her own child down with her own hands and walking away, and she would have to live with that for every day that remained. Saturday night, the 7th day of the loop, Merritt sat at the kitchen table, as she did every night. But instead of looking out the window, she looked down at her left wrist. The newborn bracelet was still lying on Jonah's desk, ever since the day she had placed it there during their first meeting. She hadn't taken it back. Her wrist had been bare for weeks now. But tonight, she opened the small drawer beside her bed and took something out. The copied newborn record she had kept from 4 years ago. The only sheet the hospital had given her along with the bracelet. On it was a line printed in small letters. Birthmark noted. Left wrist, crescent shape. She looked at that line. For 4 years, she had read it every night. And every night, it had been the only proof that her child had ever existed. Now her child was alive, laughing, folding paper airplanes from wrinkled paper, but calling her Miss Merritt. Merritt folded the paper again and tucked it into the pocket of her coat. She stood, washed her face, put on her coat, went to the door. She didn't call a taxi. She walked. 15 minutes to the bus stop. 30 minutes to the Northern District. 10 minutes on foot from the last stop to the gate of the Winslow mansion. She hadn't come to demand, hadn't come to let go. She had come because there was a question she couldn't answer alone, and the only person who could sit with her in front of that question was the man raising her son behind this gate. She pressed the bell. Conrad opened the gate for Merritt without asking. He called inside, then led her through the hall, up the stairs, and out onto the second-floor balcony at the back of the mansion. Jonah was already there. He was sitting in a wooden chair, no suit jacket, no tie, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, a glass of water on the small table beside him. In front of him was the night view of Chicago, millions of lights spreading all the way to the horizon. He didn't look surprised to see her. Maybe he had been waiting. Maybe he knew she would come, sooner or later, because the question they were both carrying wasn't the kind of question anyone could avoid forever. "Beck is asleep," he said when Merritt sat down in the chair across from him. "He falls asleep at 8:30, hugging his stuffed dinosaur, lying on his left side. Every night is the same." Merritt nodded slightly. She didn't ask why he was telling her that detail. She understood. He was telling her that he knew how his son slept, that for the past 4 years, he had been there every night, that he wasn't a father on paper. He was the father on the floor, beside the hospital bed. With a suit shoulder, Beck buried his face against every afternoon. The two of them sat in silence for a while. The Chicago night wind moved softly across the balcony, carrying a chill from Lake Michigan. Somewhere below, there was the distant sound of cars, the sound of a train horn from the direction of the port. Jonah spoke first. He didn't look at her. He looked at the city. "My mother founded the St. Clair Foundation to help children. She believed power only meant something if it could protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. After she died, I gave the foundation to Patricia because my mother trusted her." He stopped. "They used it to do the opposite, right under my eyes. One sentence, nothing more. No explanation of what Dorothy had been like, what year she had founded the foundation, or what illness had taken her. Just one sentence. And it was heavy enough for Merritt to understand that Jonah hadn't only lost his trust in Patricia, he had lost trust in himself, in his own ability to protect the most important things in his life. Merritt was quiet for a while. Then she said softly, "You didn't fail. You raised Beck. For 4 years, you loved him, cared for him, made horse noises to make him laugh. That's what your mother wanted, not the foundation. You taking care of a child who needed to be loved." Jonah looked at her. He said nothing, but the way he looked at her then was different from every time before. It wasn't the gaze of a man assessing her. It wasn't the gaze of someone controlling the room. It wasn't even the gaze of a crime boss looking at an ally. It was the gaze of someone who had just heard something he had needed to hear for a long time, something no one else had said. The wind passed between them. Leaves rustled in the garden below. Merritt drew in a breath. "I didn't come here to claim my son," she said. Jonah didn't react. He waited. "And I didn't come here to let go." Silence. "I came because I have a question I can't answer alone." She looked at him. "Is there any way Beck doesn't lose anyone?" The question hung in the Chicago night air. Jonah didn't answer right away. He looked out over the city whose every corner, every road, every stream of money he controlled. He looked at it as if searching for an answer somewhere among the millions of lights. Then he looked back at her. The DNA result is yours, he said, his voice slow and clear, every word carrying its own weight. The law is on your side. If you want to take your son back, I won't stop you. I won't separate a child from his birth mother. He stopped, breathed in, and when he said the next sentence, his voice changed. It wasn't the voice of a crime boss. It wasn't the voice of a man who controlled everything. It was the voice of a father seeing the possibility of losing his child, with no envelope of evidence, no 30-second countdown, no power in the world that could help him. But I'm asking you for one thing. Don't make him lose another father. He's already lost enough. The last word cracked, not in a dramatic way, not with a sob, not with a bowed head or shaking shoulders. It was just that the word enough left his mouth with a small fracture, small enough for Merritt to hear that behind the concrete wall Jonah Winslow had built around himself for years, there was a man who was afraid, truly afraid. His eyes were red. His hand gripped the arm of the wooden chair, his knuckles turning white, and he didn't try to hide it. For the first time in front of Merritt, he didn't try to hide it. Merritt looked at him, for a long time, looked at his red eyes, looked at his white knuckles, looked at the crack in his voice that he hadn't managed to patch in time, and she saw more clearly than ever before. The man in front of her wasn't the one who had taken her child. He was the one who had kept her child alive, loved, and happy through the 4 years when she couldn't be beside him. I don't want Beck to lose anyone, Merritt said, her voice clear, not trembling, not hesitating. Not his daddy, not his mother. I want to stay, slowly, step by step, so he can know me, get used to me, and one day choose for himself what he wants to call me. Maybe it'll be Mommy. Maybe it'll still be Miss Merritt. I'll accept either one, but I'll be here. She stopped. Do you agree? Jonah looked at her. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he nodded. I agree. One word. No conditions, no contract, no attachment. Just one word. And it changed all 3 of their lives. No one hugged anyone. There was no kiss. No music swelling in the background. Only 2 people sitting on the mansion balcony, looking out at Chicago at 10 o'clock at night, with the wind moving softly, the lights flickering, and in a second-floor bedroom, a 4-year-old boy hugging his stuffed dinosaur and sleeping peacefully, unaware that on the balcony below, 2 adults had just decided he would not lose anyone again. Never. In the weeks after that night on the balcony, everything changed in a way no one gave a name to. There was no official announcement. No family meeting. No one sat Beck down to explain that from now on, Miss Merritt would come more often. It simply happened, naturally, like water finding its way downhill. Merritt came to the Winslow mansion 4 or 5 times a week. At first, she came in the afternoon, played with Beck, then left before dinner. Then little by little, she stayed for dinner. Then she stayed to read Beck a story before bedtime. Then one time, Beck fell asleep on the sofa while she was telling a story, and Jonah carried him upstairs while Merritt gathered the books from the floor, and neither of them thought it was strange. It wasn't strange. It was right. Beck began asking every morning, "Is Miss Merritt coming today?" That question became the opening of each day, as important as what he wanted to eat for breakfast or what color shirt he wanted to wear. When Merritt came, Beck pulled her all through the house, showing her every new thing, a new drawing, a new toy car, the ant he had seen in the garden. When Merritt didn't come, Beck asked once, and then stopped, not crying, not angry, but that afternoon he was a little quieter than usual. Jonah noticed it. Merritt noticed it too, so she tried not to miss a day if she could help it. On a Saturday afternoon, Merritt sat on the living room floor watching Beck play with a puzzle. A large puzzle, 50 pieces, showing a house with a flower garden and a blue sky. Beck had been working on it for nearly an hour, patient in a way surprising for a 4-year-old child. He tried each piece, turned it, flipped it, compared it, placed it, then took it out again. Merritt sat beside him. She didn't help, didn't prompt him, because Beck had made it very clear from the beginning. Beck does it himself. And Merritt respected that. She only sat there on the floor, legs crossed, watching her son focus on each puzzle piece with the most serious eyes in the world. He finished the roof of the house, then the flower garden, then the sky, until only 3 pieces were left. 3 pieces lying in the very center of the picture, connecting the roof to the garden, connecting the sky to the earth. Without those 3 pieces, the picture was still empty in the middle. Beck picked up the first piece and set it in place. It fit. The second piece. It fit. The third piece. The final piece. Beck placed it down and pressed lightly with his tiny palm. It fit. The picture was complete. The house, the flower garden, the sky, all joined together, with no empty space left. Beck lifted his head, his eyes bright, and looked at Merritt. "Miss Merritt, these 3 pieces have to be together for it to be finished," he said, carefree and simple, as though it were only an observation about a puzzle and not something enormous. But Merritt looked at the puzzle, then looked at Beck, then lifted her eyes to Jonah. He was standing in the doorway, holding a glass of water, his back leaning against the doorframe. How long he had been standing there, she didn't know, but his eyes were on her and Beck on the floor, and in that gaze there was no control, no assessment, no concrete wall. There was only a man looking at the 2 most important people in his life sitting together on the living room floor of his home. 3 pieces had to be together for it to be finished. Merritt smiled. Just a little, but it was real. The kind of smile that didn't need a reason, didn't need effort, didn't need anyone's permission. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who had just realized she had arrived where she belonged, without needing anyone to tell her. Meredith Calloway had lived for 4 years, believing that the plastic bracelet on her wrist was the only thing left of her child. She had been wrong. Her child was still alive, in another house, with another father, carrying a name she hadn't chosen. For 4 years, she had walked the same streets, cooked noodles in the same kitchen, and every year lit 1 candle on a small cupcake, singing happy birthday to a child she believed no longer existed in the world. But life hadn't taken her child forever. It had only sent her down a longer road, a darker road, a more painful road, so she could find her way back. And when she found him, she didn't demand, didn't fight to possess, didn't pull her son out of the arms of the father who had loved him for 4 years. She chose to stay, slowly, step by step. 1 afternoon on the floor, folding paper airplanes at a time. 1 dinner at the same table at a time. 1 night reading stories until her child fell asleep on the sofa at a time. She chose to let her son know her for himself, grow used to her for himself, and one day, choose for himself what he wanted to call her. Maybe Mommy, maybe still Miss Merritt. She accepted both. Because family isn't possession. Family is the choice to stay, even when everything isn't perfect, even when the wound hasn't fully healed, even when the road home is longer than anyone ever deserved to walk. Sometimes, people don't need to fight and seize in order to have something. They only need enough patience to belong. And sometimes, a 4-year-old child, sitting on the floor, placing the last 3 puzzle pieces into a picture, says the simplest sentence in the world, and it reaches all the way to the deepest part of the heart. These 3 pieces have to be together for it to be finished. If this story touched your heart, please tap the heart so more people can hear it too. Share this video with the people you love, with anyone who needs a story that can help them heal, because sometimes just 1 story is enough to change someone's day. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and share what you felt from deep in your heart. We're always listening, and we cherish every line you write. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the moving stories we share every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.